This is Mikey Mason, and you're listening to Why We Game.
I'm Brodor, and this is Why We Game. There is no guest this episode because it is episode 37. And as a devout fan of the movie Clerks, 37 did indeed need to include me. If you find this a bit narcissistic or self-aggrandizing, I don't blame you. And I encourage you to tune in to the next episode with someone who is not me. Frankly, I find doing this without an actual guest much, much more difficult because I have balked or done an audible multiple times because I don't have somebody to play off. And for me, that is particularly challenging. And I know I tell a lot of stories about myself on the show, and I do other podcasts where listeners may hear about me, but I really wanted to sort of take the time to talk about why I game, why it is that I got into the hobby, why it is that I got into the industry as a retailer, and why I want a future as, please forgive the expression, but as an influencer in the industry going forward. I absolutely love this hobby, and I have dedicated a lot of passion, both personally and professionally, to it. And I just want to be part of it, and I want to see it thrive, and I want to do my part to help it thrive and to perpetuate it into other areas, into people who haven't exposed to the hobby, into future generations, as lame as that sounds. There's a little bit of noise in the background. I've got my dog here with me. I don't know. It's difficult to explain him, but he needs to be, he's more cat than dog, but he needs to be in the room with me. So if you hear him rustling, you have my apologies. Anyway, let's get into why I love the movie Clerks. When I was a young lad, I was in I was maybe 19, 20 years old. I was probably 19. I was working at 7-Eleven, and my buddy Joe, who was also in my fraternity, and yeah, we'll get into that. Joe and I worked across the street from one another. I worked at 7-Eleven, which is a convenience store. You know, their hours used to be 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., and at the time that was a big deal. Now it means nothing. But I worked at 7-Eleven. Across the street at this mom and pop movie video place was my buddy Joe. Joe and I, we lived in the same neighborhood. We went to the same high school. We went to the same college. We joined the same fraternity. I would not go so far as to say that Joe and I were super close, but some of the most important life experiences that I ever had were with him. And Clerks was one of them because Joe's working at this movie place across the street. He would routinely come across the street and, just not hang out, but, get a soda, or, candy bar, that sort of shit. And he comes in one day and he's like, dude, you've got to come over to my place tonight and watch this movie. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, all right. What's it about? He goes, it's about us. And I know that sounds so fucking lame, but at the time, it was remarkable to be a nerdy guy who just started experimenting with illicit substances and kind of becoming an adult and holding down a job and trying to go to school and blah, blah, blah. And then you see this high-strung guy who works at a convenience store, at a C-store, which was me because I was really worried about getting good grades and being not just being a good student, but being a good citizen and being a good kid that didn't rock the boat at home. But Joe was not that guy. I mean, he was confident and he was athletic and he was great at martial arts and he just fucking rolled with life, right? And it was wonderful to see exaggerated versions of those things in a movie. So yeah, it's fucking special to me. I think Kevin Smith's pretty much a genius, even though the bulk of his work sucks, in this one person's opinion. So yeah, I'm 37. I got exposed to gaming when I was a little kid. I very distinctly remember we lived in Salem, Missouri, and we lived in the house that my dad had designed and built. I'm on my mom's lap, and we're all around the table, and it's my dad and my mom and their friends, one of them who had this terrible, terrible haircut like this, he looked like BD from Buck Rogers, but with hair and a terrible mustache. And he's running this, what I recall being this gothic horror. And he's describing this flesh golem. And I saw Frankenstein's monster and I had nightmares that night. But he had, again, using the fucking lame parlance, he had transported me to a different world. I was hooked. I wanted to be in that world all the time because it was better than the world that I was in, better than the world that I lived in. And I'm not going to get into it too much, but it was a tough childhood, and I had it easiest of the three of us between my older sister and our older brother. But that's neither here nor there. What I had discovered in that moment was my imagination. That's the time that I remember make 'em up. Before that, with your, Fisher Price, whatever people they were called, and your Legos or building blocks or what have you, being a toddler sitting on my mom's lap and having someone put a vision in my mind with their storytelling absolutely just flipped a switch that just never turned off. And I've always been a part of it to some degree. Once we moved out of Salem, we moved out of Salem. My parents' marriage is on the rocks, and we moved to this place in Missouri called O'Fallon, which now is kind of a big deal, but back then was no deal at all. And we lived in one house for a bit, and then I wasn't gaming in that house, but I was playing with my G.I. Joes and playing with Dougie Butt Jr., my neighbor next door, and that sort of thing. But when we moved to the other side of O'Fallon, and my parents were, for fucking sure going to get a divorce, I remember my brother being into gaming. And, to me, my older brother is the example of what it means to be, and, to be a strong sibling and a good parent and a good person. And I've always wanted to emulate him. But my brother's also extremely creative. He has a wicked imagination and is remarkably good at engaging with people on an emotional level for story. And whatever he did, I wanted to do. He listened to Rush, I listened to Rush. He read Dragonlance, I read Dragonlance. I looked up to him so much because he was so strong in his ability to defy the nature of our existence and our home life. And he just stood as a bulwark for me against this horror. And I'll always admire him for that. But the other thing that I just adore about him is that during the time of the Satanic Panic, when people were hiding that they were into this thing, I don't know how my brother was outside the house with it. I don't, but I remember when I saw my brother and it came to gaming, there was no shame. There was no shame in it. It was something to be admired and revered and appreciated and taken seriously and respected. And again, I know that sounds really, really fucking dumb, but it's how I feel about the hobby. It was such an important thing for me for surviving childhood. So as soon as I was old enough to shoplift, I started stealing D&D stuff from a bookstore called Walden Books. My best friend in the world at the time and our third cohort, we would work our way onto trips to the bowling alley with my best friend Travis's grandma, Tommy. Tommy would take us to the bowling alley. she would take us to the bowling alley, and we would hang out while she did her bowling leagues, and we would walk across, a very busy road in the Cave Springs, Missouri area, and we would across the street to an old bookstore called Walden Books, where you could get D&D stuff, and we would rob them blind. And I'm not proud of this. I'm very, very ashamed of what we had done. And frankly, if there were a Walden Books to send restitution to, I probably on some level would feel guilt that I want to pay them restitution because I owe them for my involvement in this hobby. Now, we, like many people at the time, did not play the game right, but that wasn't the important part. The important part was that we adored this thing and that we loved these worlds to which we could escape and be different, not be ourselves, not be the things that we were ashamed of or ridiculed for. We could be strong and heroic and the center of things, and that is amazing. Even though, of course, I knew at the time that stealing was wrong, I still did it because it was more important to me to have fuel for that experience than it was to do the right thing, and that's selfish and shitty. But it's what I did. I'm not proud of it. We mostly would just do these character winks where we would just sit around and roll dice and talk about all the cool anime style shit that, we didn't have or understand anime like that at the time, but we had big cartoons that were certainly influenced by anime. We would sort of go on wanks about that sort of stuff and have super heroic, high-level characters, real Monty Hall shit. For those of you who are younger and don't get the reference, there used to be a game show, and there was a game show host named Monty Hall, and you would pick a door, and Monty would give you cash and prizes and treasures or humility. And many gamers at the time that gave out a lot of just a gratuitous, embarrassing amount of treasure that if anyone could dig into my recollection and see those things, I certainly would be embarrassed by the dumb shit that we did. But we just showered ourselves and stuff. I mean, real Monty Hall garbage gaming. But one thing that I took from my brothers that for the most part, unless somebody was really, really bigger than me, I wasn't too ashamed about being a gamer. And so I met other people who were into that just by the nature of that I didn't hide it as much as others did. Certainly I did not let my freak flag fly, but I was more out of the proverbial closet than a lot of the people at the time. And certainly more so than people of my brother's generation, because I'm 46, he's 52, so he had it much worse in that situation. But I never, ever, ever let it go. Eventually, I left. My parents get divorced, and I'm living on this street called Danny Lane in O'Fallon, Missouri, and I'm doing gaming with Putz and with Travis and with a couple of other kids that would kind of float in and out in the neighborhood. But nothing ever serious, nothing real. It was all poser make-believe gaming. It wasn't real gaming. I didn't get into really, really being a gamer and stop being a shoplifter until I moved in with my father. So after my parents' divorce, I lived with her for years, and then eventually I ended up moving in with my dad, and my dad's from the neck down stripper body second wife. And we're number two. So my mom was number one. My dad's second wife, stripper body, was number two. And his current wife, number three, is remarkable. They improve every time. I started living with my dad, and I'm in eighth grade, not really meeting any gamer guys, freshman in high school, not really meeting any gamer guys, but still into it, still going to the game store when I can. Start getting into BattleTech, start dabbling in Warhammer 40,000, miniature gaming stuff, things that I could get into that my buddies might be intrigued by, but also I had a fixation on toy soldiers. I've always had a fixation for toy soldiers. Modeling is in my blood. My dad loved to make, aviation models. My brother loved aviation models as a kid. My brother loved miniatures, and, I idolized my brother, and I've got the modeling bug. Anyway, I'm doing some modeling and dabbling in gaming and trying to kind of cling on to that world vicariously. And then I meet who is to this day one of my best friends on earth, this guy named Adam. I'm a sophomore in high school and Adam's a freshman in high school. And dude, we just fucking click. We just, bam, we just get into it. I don't remember the exact course of events, but I do remember this. Adam introduced me to Shadowrun. And I was like, this is the stupidest fucking thing in the world. It has orcs and dragons and elves and dwarves and laser guns and machine guns and drones and hacking and this weird cyber world, and none of this makes sense. I can't believe you put all of these ingredients into a blender and that they taste delicious. So yeah, I was in. I love Shadowrun. So we played a ton of Shadowrun first edition. We stepped out and we tried other stuff, but nothing ever clicked with us like Shadowrun had done. So Adam and I, we're thick as thieves, right? Like we're still friends to this day. I was supposed to be the best man in his wedding in 2005, but I had a personal tragedy and couldn't go. I mean, we still talk. I adore him. We have matching tattoos on our left shoulders. That's how intimate platonically we are with one another. I adore him. Anyway, he really is the one that got me into not just respecting the game as an exercise of imagination, but respecting and appreciating the game as a course of mechanics and a balanced play field on which we can all engage. That was just amazing to me. That was really the piece that I'm missing. I am not original in saying this. I think, and I'm pretty sure that Chad Watler and I talked about this when I interviewed him on this show, that gaming is basically two different things. It's a narrative structure, it's a collection of heroes' journeys, arcs, what have you, and mechanics that help facilitate conflict inside that narrative, right? And I didn't really get that. Now, I like miniature games and I like crunchy games like that, but I would rather play a role-playing game because I crave that level of the escapism. And that, for me, really is why I'm in the hobby, to leave reality. I have never liked me. I've never liked being me, and I'm not being self-deprecating to get, oh, woe is Mike, whatever, and have a fucking pity party. What I'm trying to say is that I've always struggled with confidence. I have always felt less than or inferior to in almost every regard, as a result of how I grew up. It is only until surviving my midlife crisis did I really develop the courage and confidence to be myself, because as I always say, I'm a late bloomer. I feel at 46 like I think that most of my friends did, maybe in their early 30s. I don't know. It's just how I feel. But the point is, I've always been gaming consistently from that point, from the 10th grade, and never, ever looked back and taken it into any group and made it a cornerstone of my social circle. The vast majority of the friendships that I have are founded on at least one cornerstone of gaming, whether that be someone who works in the hobby industry in some facet, but more commonly, people who are my friends who are also hobbyists that are into gaming, whether it's board gaming, miniature gaming, or role playing. I love the world. I love the culture. I love being a part of it. So much so that when the opportunity to become a local hobby retailer presented itself, I jumped. A guy who was a really good friend of mine at the time, this guy Rick, was working for a local store called the Fantasy Shop. And the Fantasy Shop is a local chain that's been around since 1981. They had at one time as many as 9 stores in 3 different states. I mean, a really, really neat, family-friendly local chain of comic and game stores. At the time, my buddy Rick was managing one of them, and he notified me, this is in 2002, that he had an opening as a clerk. I was like, wow, I could take a pay cut from this optical company that I've been at for several years and really built up some social credit and built up a decent hourly wage. I could bail on all of that to lose everything and get minimum wage to sell comic books and Dungeons and Dragons. I was like, fuck yeah, I'm going to do that. Of course, I talked to my wife about it. My wife is the reasonable one in the relationship, but she did at the time and has for all but maybe 6 months of our near 30-year relationship, always made more money than me. Has always been the support, the family financial structure. And I have never felt emasculated by that at all. That's a different story altogether, but she was cool with it. So I took this job and I go work for the fantasy shop, and after 13 plus years of being there, I had worked my way from being a sales associate, clerk, what have you, at one location to an assistant manager at our main location to a manager of our smallest location, basically a one-person operation. It was just me. Then to be the manager of the largest location, to then be the general manager of the company and overseeing all of the managers and their locations. Eventually, the owners of the company bought an RV. They hit the road. They would still oversee the corporate operations, but when it came to like the day-to-day in the trenches stuff, that was my responsibility to take care of. I loved that job. I love that company. I love their philosophy. Dave Wallace has always been a father figure to me from very early on at my time in that company, despite how I left. And that's a story that I won't bore you guys with for now. That's a convention over drink sort of thing. But I have tremendous adoration for the man. If you're an older retailer, you probably know who he is. If you're a newer retailer, I would encourage you to buy his book. But he's one of the early guys in the industry. I mean, he's been doing it for 40 years. Not a lot of hobby stores can say that. But anyway, Dave mentored me for a long, long time and taught me a lot about the industry. But I think the most important thing he ever instilled to me was that we're here as ambassadors for this hobby. It's like we're not selling any individual product. What we are doing is we are acting as ambassadors, liaisons between the clientele and the product. It doesn't matter if you buy today or tomorrow. What matters is that we're building a rapport for you so you have a comfortable, knowledgeable place to engage in the hobby. And that to me is just brilliant. Now, Dave and I had our falling out, but during the time that I was there, I matured as a person. I learned so much as an actual human resource manager, not the villain that works in your company whose sole mission is to ensure that the company doesn't face lawsuits. That's their fucking job, but not to actually develop you as a resource in the company. I'm sorry, I'm ranting. The point is, Dave taught me a lot, but that lesson was the one that always sticks with me, is that's the gig. And I recognize that that's what I do now, is that I'm an ambassador for the hobby. And it made me really kind of rethink my whole structure. And I'm still trying to find my voice. And I'm certain that is evident in the show. I think it's improved. I hope it's improved. But again, that's neither here nor there. So I'm working in the industry. I start going to trade shows and to distribution open houses and start kind of building a name for myself in the industry. Eventually, Dave nominates me to be on the retailer division board of the Game Manufacturers Association, or GAMA. Now, I served very briefly on the GAMA board. I didn't do anything with the GAMA board except attend a handful of meetings. I made no accomplishment in GAMA other than I got nominated by my boss at the time, but then I got elected. So I got myself elected. obviously being on Dave Wallace's coattails got me there. But I hope to think that maybe there were people in that room that voted for me that didn't really know Dave at the time. That was a great achievement because now I was in a position where I could actually influence the industry in a positive way. But more importantly, and I know, God, it sounds so narcissistic, it's gross, but also, I mean, what can I learn, right? I mean, when I went to the Gamma Expos, or what used to be called the Gamma Trade Show, or GTS, but I think they changed the name because it's the name of a distributor. I don't know, I could be wrong. But anyway, going to the Gamma Expo, I learned a lot from other people, and I'm starting to learn a lot about the industry and things that could be different than the way Dave does stuff. And that was really an enlightening experience. And now I'm in a position where I'm on this board and I get to learn from and work with and exchange ideas with the real movers and shakers of retailers in the industry. And that was super, super exciting. And then Dave and I had a terrible falling out, of which I certainly carry at least 50% of the responsibility of how things fell out. I think that you could make even an argument for a 60-40 split, depending on my humility level that day. But I had to leave Gamma. I wasn't a retailer anymore. And so I was only on the board for a few short months from March to August of 2015. So not very long at all. I really didn't accomplish anything there, but it broke my heart to have to step down from that position because I feel like that all of the effort that I'd put in at the fantasy shop had finally resulted in something, and that I had an opportunity to not just be, Mike that is the general manager for the fantasy shop for Dave Wallace, but be, Mike, the guy that Dave Wallace mentored and who is now doing his own thing. After leaving the fantasy shop, I went to go work for a medical company for a couple of years. And that is a story for another time. Again, over drinks, it's not interesting. What is important to this episode is that eventually, through some people that I know on the Geek Way to the West board game convention on their ownership board, I know somebody who knew Steve Lucinski, the owner of Miniature Market. They put a bug in the owner's ear that I was interested in getting back into the hobby retail game. Miniature Market's owner reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to come in and do an interview? And I ended up working for Steve for a couple of years. It was really an exciting and enlightening experience because as an outsider and competitor on a brick and mortar retail level, you had an idea of who your competitors were. You would visit their stores. Customers would tell you things about them. And obviously, you do your best to not talk shit about the competition on the sales floor because it's unprofessional and it's tacky. You do that shit behind closed doors. So I didn't have a good idea of who Steve was or what his stores were like. I just had the outside observer and scuttlebutt. Having the opportunity to work for him and to see the inside, sort of the guts, obviously not the real serious down in the weeds details, but to see the inner workings of the machine was really, really fascinating. It gave me a really interesting perspective on Steve as a business person and what Miniature Market was doing, but more importantly, what Steve is going to be capable of doing with the model that he has. If you want to hear me talk about that, watch my YouTube video, Miniature Market Shithole ? I had a great time working for Steve, and then the opportunity to kind of strike out on my own and become a pseudo a quasi journalist, and interview people in the industry came up. And I was like, wow, this is really, really great. I had an opportunity to go for some time and travel to conventions and meet people and start doing interviews and try to build a name for myself. And this was in early March of 2020. So I go to the Gamma Expo in Reno, Nevada. with Dan Repperger of Fear the Boot, and Dan and I go as media. We both join Gamma as media. We sign up, we get our badges, and we're going to go as media. We're going to interview people. We're going to talk. We're going to do our thing. We're having a great time until it's getting toward the end of the week, the end of the expo, and all this scuttlebutt is going around about this thing, COVID-19. Nobody at the time knows exactly what's going on with COVID, but we do know that a lot of the major names, like the Watsies, they didn't show up because they had concerns about COVID already. And I don't know what the scuttlebutt was on the West Coast at the time, but certainly in the Midwest, I was not tuned into what this thing was or how big a deal it was becoming. But a lot of the larger groups said, we're not going to the Gamma Expo this year. Dan and I went anyway, because again, we're going to go, we're going to have a good time, kind of, pseudo vacation, etc. But the expo basically gets cut short because attendees, vendors, etc., just start, we got to go, this thing is serious. People are starting to be concerned about the cancellation of flights, what have you, so much so that Repperger and I, he rented a car. Because he's super smart, just from his phone while all of this is going down. He's like, we're canceling our plane tickets. We're getting a car. We drove home 31 hours straight. Well, okay, Dan drove. I slept. Again, that's a story. There's a bonus episode of Fear the Boot where we talk about that. Anyway, for the last year, I have been in a holding pattern. I've been in this area where, as a middle-aged person who is not particularly adept with technology, who is not particularly fond of technology, who really thought that I was going to be able to build a name going face-to-face and meeting people and kind of learn the technology as I go, have been stuck with, during the pandemic, using primarily the technology as the way to communicate, and I don't like it. I'm not good at it. I don't understand it all that particularly well. Most importantly, there's no soul in it. I feel like I am more comfortable in the conversation when I'm sitting directly across from someone and we're face to face, and I can read body language and various cues. Nonverbal communication is the bulk of our communication. And I don't know, I hate talking through digital media. Again, that my moping aside, during the course of this last year, it has been difficult for me to frankly not be lazy and get off my ass and do the work. And so now that the vaccine is a thing at the time of this recording, I'm less than 24 hours away from my second dose of the vaccine. Not that I want to get into that politics, but the point is that I'm wicked encouraged just to see that things are starting to open up and that there's going to be opportunity to go to conventions and to meet people. Just sending a cold email or a Facebook message or some sort of digital communication like that is just not the way that I'm comfortable introducing myself. It's not the way that I'm comfortable talking to people. So the prospect of being able to hit the road and meet people in person and see game stores in person is very, very exciting for me. And I hope that for the people who tune into this show, that might be a cool thing for you. Hopefully, I will start to get to meet some of you while I'm out on the road. While there are not a lot of you, you're out there, and I appreciate it. What's the future for what I'm going to do with this thing now that I'm, almost fully vaccinated and the world is kind of opening up? We hope. I definitely plan on spending most of this September on the road, September, early October, doing conventions, things of that nature. I really need to get off my ass and start kind of booking and planning the rest of my year. I'm absolutely totally want to do hostile style. So going forward, I think what I'm going to do, dear listeners, is that I'm going to let you guys know when I have a road trip, where I'm going to be, when I'm going to be, and, depending on if things pass the sniff test, maybe you'll help me crash on your couch. But I'm going to continue doing my weekly videos. I've been doing a little bit of work on an editing software called Lightwork, so I can get that figured out and I can make them look a little bit more professional. But I assure you that I am not going to deviate from the sort of old school newsroom thing. That seems to get some pretty good feedback. Speaking of feedback, I really would like to know a couple of things from you, the listener. So send your emails to Brodeur, BRODEUR, at goinfo.org about, hey, do you have somebody in mind? I know I do need to say a big thank you to Sergeant Dan out there because he got me in contact with somebody from Columbia Games, which I need to schedule an interview with. But if you have ideas for people with whom you think I should have a conversation, please let me know. If you have editorial topic ideas for my weekly video segment that I'm doing, let me know. I would love to get your guys' feedback. I've got a few queued up, but I would definitely like to stay ahead of the curve on that. And then I'm also thinking about doing a Brodeur After Hours game review. Some people have inquired about my shelves and what games and books I have back there. So what I'm thinking of doing is, like my tweed-jacketed editorial segment, I do a weekly cardigan with a glass of whiskey or something of that effect, and I break down a game. But my pitch is this. I break the game down on 3 different levels. I do an elevator pitch. I do, this is how I would sell it if I was still a retailer. And this is what I like or don't like about the game as a gamer. I really would appreciate feedback on that level. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the next guest. Why We Game is a production of the Influence Foundation. All rights reserved. Audio editing by Brodeur. Music by Owen Godwin.